Walter Grady had long since accepted that he was invisible. In Brooklyn's Park Slope neighborhood, he was a quiet fixture, an old man with a long gray beard and a green canvas military pack that never left his shoulder. He wasn't like the others who wandered the streets. He didn't shout, didn't beg, didn't carry cardboard signs. He drifted through the city like a winter fog, light and unnoticed, moving from stoop to stoop so no one would ever say he lingered too long. He had served once. 21 years in the army. He'd worn the uniform through sandstorms in Iraq and cold dawns in Afghanistan. His last tour ended just before the war headlines began to shrink. He had medals, though he never spoke of them. Once, his name had been typed onto thank-you letters, stitched onto fabric, etched into plaques. That was long ago. He returned home with scars no surgeon could see. But he had Margaret then. Her voice, her quiet hands, the way she remembered how he took his tea. For a while, that was enough. Until it wasn't. When Margaret first got sick, they thought it was nothing. The VA said it was stress, maybe diet, and gave her pamphlets and pills. By the time someone looked closer, it was already too late. She died in spring. The kind of spring that doesn't warm, just teases. Walter buried her and packed their apartment into boxes he gave away to neighbors. The one thing he kept was her rosary, though his fingers rarely touched it anymore. He sold the apartment and wired the money to the cancer foundation Margaret used to donate to. It felt like the only decision that made sense. Then he walked out the door and never went back. That was 2008. Since then, Walter had learned how to disappear. He kept his hair trimmed with a small folding knife, bathed in the church basement showers on Fridays, and picked the cleanest doorways to rest his back against. He spoke only when necessary. He was not unkind, only distant. People assumed he was another lost cause, and Walter never corrected them. He lived on the edge of hunger, always in negotiation with it. Usually, collecting bottles was enough. On a good day, he could afford a sandwich, or if luck favored him, a hot meal from the soup kitchen 2 avenues over. But some days weren't good. That November day wasn't good. The air was brittle with cold. Walter's fingers had gone numb through his gloves, and the stiffness in his knees reminded him of too many damp nights on concrete. He hadn't eaten in 3 days. His stomach didn't growl anymore, it clenched, like a fist inside him, quiet and cruel. He passed Morelli's market just after noon. The smell of bread, a warmth he hadn't tasted in days, wafted from the door as it opened for another customer. He stood near the entrance for a full minute before stepping in. The store was small and old-fashioned. The floor tiles cracked in places. The windows fogged with breath and weather. Walter nodded politely to the cashier, as he always did, and wandered the aisles pretending to browse. He saw the loaf on a discount rack, half price, baked the day before, still wrapped tight. His hand trembled as he picked it up. He looked toward the counter. The owner, Mr. Morelli, was busy helping someone else. Walter hesitated. Then, with all the care of a man handling a sacred object, he slipped the loaf into his coat and zipped it halfway, leaving part of the plastic exposed. He didn't run. He walked toward the exit like he belonged there. His gait slow, deliberate, almost weary. What he didn't know was that new mirrors had gone up above the aisles just days before, angled carefully to show every blind spot. Walter, for all his caution, had walked directly into one. Mr. Morelli looked up, saw the bulge under the coat, and reached for the phone. Walter was still on the sidewalk when the police arrived. 2 officers in pressed uniforms. The older one didn't hesitate. The younger, Officer Jenkins, paused when he saw the man's face. Then he saw the dog tags around his neck, tarnished but intact. Walter didn't resist. His wrists slid easily into the cuffs. His coat sagged open, revealing the loaf. The cold cut through the worn lining as he was led to the patrol car. A few people glanced up as they passed. No one stopped walking. At the precinct, he was booked like anyone else. Fingerprints, photo, brief questions. His assigned public defender didn't ask about his history, only told him his court time. The bread was logged as evidence. That night, he slept in holding. The bench was metal, too short for his legs. The lights buzzed above him without dimming. The scent of bleach and old sweat pressed into every breath. He lay on his side, curled tight against the cold, and for the first time in years, allowed himself to remember her voice. Not the words, just the hum of it. He saw her hands tying an apron in the kitchen, her shadow in the hallway as she turned off the lights. He didn't cry. He hadn't for a long time. But something in him flickered. By morning, Walter stood in a courtroom wearing the same wrinkled coat, the same thin shoes. No one had brought him a change of clothes. No one was there to vouch for him. The benches were half full with strangers waiting for different kinds of judgment. The judge flipped through his file without lifting his eyes. Walter Grady was just another name in the long line of those who had already been forgotten. The courtroom was cold in the way institutional spaces always are, lit by fluorescence that flattened every face, with worn linoleum floors that echoed footsteps like accusations. Walter stood quietly between the public defender and a bailiff who didn't look at him. He didn't know what time it was, only that the hours had stacked like bricks since he'd first been arrested. The cuffs had left faint red bands around his wrists. He hadn't eaten since the bread he never got to taste. Most eyes in the room skimmed over him. To the clerks, he was a file number, to the young prosecutor, a minor interruption. No family waited on the benches. No familiar face marked the sterile air with memory. Walter could have vanished entirely and no one would have noticed. The case was called without ceremony. A low murmur followed his name, just one among dozens. The charge was petty theft, third offense. The recommendation was clear: continued detention. No address, no income, prior infractions. The words came quickly, without malice, like a form letter read aloud. As the judge flipped through the paperwork, something in his posture shifted. He paused longer than expected. His fingers stilled on a page. Then his eyes lifted and settled directly on Walter for the first time. A beat passed. Then two. The silence stretched taut, like a string before it snaps. He didn't speak. Instead, he stood, suddenly, sharply, and announced a recess. Gasps rippled faintly from the gallery. Judges didn't rise for minor cases. They didn't pause for bread thieves. Yet Judge Michael Carmichael stepped down from the bench and left the courtroom without another word. Walter remained where he was, neither confused nor expectant. If life had taught him anything, it was not to assume grace. In his chambers, the judge opened a locked drawer and removed a photograph. It was worn at the edges, the ink faded but legible. A unit stood in fatigues before a desert tent, smiling, tired, sunburned. He studied the faces one by one until his gaze landed on the tall man in the back row. The same weathered face now standing in court. Walter Grady. Staff Sergeant. Quartermaster turned convoy commander. A man whose name had once meant survival. Carmichael stared at the picture. Then he opened an old military database, one he hadn't used in years. His fingers typed carefully. The records confirmed what he remembered. Walter's file included commendations, 2 Bronze Stars, for letters of valor, a special notation for saving 17 soldiers by driving a burning transport vehicle away from his unit. And one more entry. A mission detail from Fallujah in 2003. During an evacuation gone wrong, an injured medic had been pinned in a ravine under enemy fire. According to the after-action report, Walter carried the man 2 miles to safety, sustaining his own injury in the process. The medic had been unconscious and badly burned. His name was listed clearly. Private First Class Michael Carmichael. The judge sat back in his chair. The memory came slowly, disconnected fragments that began to reassemble, a burning haze, the smell of diesel, the agony in his shoulder, and then, through the blur, a man's steady grip pulling him up a ravine, murmuring to stay awake, that help was coming. That man had been Walter. The judge's throat tightened. In 20 years, he had not once seen or heard of the man who saved his life. He assumed he'd been redeployed, perhaps promoted. Certainly not living on the street, arrested for trying to eat. Back in the courtroom, Walter stood unmoving. His eyes were fixed on the floor. The silence around him had hardened into a wall. The door opened, and Judge Carmichael returned. He did not sit. He looked directly at Walter. Then, in an act so simple yet so seismic, he walked down from the bench and stood in front of him. No one spoke. He asked for the charges to be dismissed. He called for a full review of Walter's military record. He cited due process, but his voice trembled slightly as he requested it. Then he turned to the prosecutor and stated that the city owed Walter Grady an apology, if not more. Gasps had turned to whispers. Reporters typed suddenly, as if awakening. The judge returned to the bench but did not resume proceedings. He ordered a formal inquiry into Walter's VA history. A public defender's mouth fell open. A clerk wiped her eyes. Walter blinked, slowly. He still did not speak. But something in his spine straightened, a quiet recognition that dignity, though long buried, still lived. After court adjourned, the judge found Walter again, this time in the hallway near the holding cell doors. He placed a folded piece of paper into the man's palm. Inside was a photo. The same one from the unit. The ink now held new weight. No words passed between them. None were needed. For the first time in 15 years, Walter stepped out into the sunlight not as a case file, not as a criminal, but as someone remembered. Walter Grady did not understand what had happened in that courtroom. Not fully. The cold institutional process he had expected, the swift sentence, the silent dismissal, had been interrupted by something rare, memory. Recognition. The weight of old sacrifice remembered not by a system, but by one man within it. He had not asked for anything. He had not tried to prove his past. And yet, without seeking redemption, he had been seen. That afternoon, a city clerk, shaken from the hearing, posted a brief note on a veterans forum. It was little more than a curiosity: a homeless man, arrested for stealing bread, identified by a judge as a decorated soldier. The story might have ended there, a short thread among hundreds. But others saw it. Within hours, the post was picked up by a local journalist, a woman whose older brother had served in the same region as Walter, whose Litter's home had once spoken of a man named Grady who could drive a truck through fire without blinking. She confirmed the details, found the photo, and published a short piece online titled, "Forgotten Hero, Brooklyn's Bread Thief Was Once a Savior in Iraq." The article spread. Other reporters began calling the courthouse, the precinct, the public defender's office. They uncovered service records, campaign medals, citation letters from commanding officers long retired. More startling still was the detail buried in the judge's own history, the rescue mission from Fallujah. A bronze star pinned to a man who'd survived because another carried him when it would have been easier to flee. The narrative wrote itself. Headlines followed: Judge recognizes homeless man as soldier who saved his life. Bronze Star recipient arrested for stealing bread sparks outcry. One loaf, one life, one nation's memory. People who had walked past Walter every day without seeing him now scoured the streets to offer thanks. But Walter had vanished again, released quietly with no forwarding address, no phone, no interest in fanfare. He had returned to his usual path, quiet, cautious, the way a man walks when he's spent years trying not to disturb anyone. It was Officer Jenkins, the younger of the two who had arrested him, who finally found him again. Not in a cell, but beneath an overpass, sitting cross-legged, eating a small meal offered by a volunteer. The officer didn't approach loudly. He didn't ask questions. He simply sat, handed Walter a thermos of coffee, and placed a folded newspaper beside him. Walter read the headline slowly. Then closed the paper and placed it under his pack. He said nothing, but his hands paused longer than usual over the rosary in his pocket. Meanwhile, something was building elsewhere. The Department of Veterans Affairs, under scrutiny for its handling of Walter's wife's illness and his subsequent disappearance, issued a rare public statement acknowledging systemic failure. A regional director offered to meet with Walter personally. Legal paperwork was expedited. His discharge benefits, suspended due to lack of contact, were reinstated. But the most unexpected message came not from a department, but from a school. An 8th grade history teacher in the Bronx had shared the article with her students. She asked them to write letters, not to a politician or a celebrity, but to Walter. She didn't know where to send them, so she mailed them all to the courthouse. Over 50 letters arrived within a week. Crayon-written words on wide-lined paper. Children who had never known war, who had never gone hungry, who wrote thank you again and again without needing to know the details. The judge read them all before passing them on. Then came the veterans. They arrived in ones and twos at first. A man with a cane and a silent salute. A woman who placed a single medal on a park bench and walked away. Soon there were more, men with jackets heavy with patches, faces marked by time and service. They came from Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Vermont. Not to speak, not to film, but to be present. To remember someone their country had once forgotten. A small ceremony was quietly planned. In Prospect Park, near the Soldiers' Arch, a temporary plaque was installed, in honor of those who return and disappear. You are still seen. Walter was invited. He didn't confirm. But on the morning of the event, as a light rain fell like breath on cold stone, a figure in a worn green jacket stepped out from beneath the trees. He said nothing. But when the names of fallen soldiers were read aloud, he stood, removed his cap, and pressed the rosary to his chest. Children watched. Reporters stayed back. A little boy near the front whispered something to his mother, and though she tried to hush him, others heard. He looks like a statue. Like the kind they make when someone saved people. Walter didn't hear. Or maybe he did. But his posture didn't change. That evening, a new article went live, titled simply, "He Didn't Want a Medal. Just a loaf of bread." In diners, in schools, in old VFW halls, people read it and sat quietly afterward. And something shifted, not quickly, not in fanfare, but in the slow awareness that sometimes the heroes they write books about are walking by them with empty pockets and worn-out shoes. And they only asked to be left with a little peace. Winter came early that year. By December, frost settled into Brooklyn's gutters before sunrise. Storefronts lined their windows with blinking lights and artificial snow, but the cold was real, and the silence it brought was the kind that seeped into bones. Walter Grady was not often seen anymore on the streets near the market, nor sleeping in his usual corner behind the laundromat. Some wondered if he had vanished again. Others hoped he hadn't. In truth, Walter had been moved, not by force or demand, but by invitation. The night after the park ceremony, he had returned to his usual resting place to find a package waiting beneath his blanket. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, bound with twine. Inside was a new coat, thick, warm, military green. In the pocket was a note, handwritten in steady block letters, "You carried us. Let us carry you now." Below the words was a name Walter remembered, Corporal Jimmy Latner, Convoy Detail, Mosul, 2004. A man he had once pulled from an overturned Humvee in a ditch. A man who now ran a transitional housing center for veterans north of the city. Walter arrived the next morning without calling ahead. He carried only his pack and his silence. Jimmy greeted him with a salute, then a handshake. No questions. No paperwork. Just a room with a small window, a clean bed, and a thermos waiting on the nightstand. Walter didn't say much in those first weeks. He rose early, cleaned his space with military precision, and took long walks on the center's grounds, even in the snow. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, his rhythm changed. He accepted hot meals, joined morning coffee in the shared kitchen, nodded at others in the hallway. The photo from the courtroom, the unit before the desert tent, appeared one day above his bed, framed with care. Beneath it, he tacked up 3 of the children's letters. The rest he kept in a shoebox under his bed, arranged by handwriting. One afternoon in January, a city official visited the center. They had traced Walter's case through the judge's office, and though they never found the exact moment the system had failed him, they agreed something needed to be made right. A modest apartment was arranged through a housing program for veterans with combat commendations. Located on the third floor of an old brick building near Prospect Park, it was nothing grand, just 2 rooms and a view of trees, but it was clean, warm, and his. Walter moved in quietly, carrying little. The building superintendent left him alone. The neighbors were respectful. Over time, some came to recognize him as the man from the article, but Walter rarely confirmed anything. He kept his new apartment like he'd kept a barracks locker, orderly, spare, dignified. Each Sunday, he returned to the park where the plaque still stood. The temporary inscription had been replaced by a permanent bronze plate. People often paused to read it, but few realized the man sometimes sitting on the nearby bench had helped inspire its words. He never sought attention. He didn't speak at events. But when asked, he always returned a nod and a thank you. Sometimes, that was enough. The Morelli market, where the arrest had taken place, did something small that few noticed. They kept a loaf of bread in a wooden box near the register labeled, "For anyone who needs one, no questions asked." Mr. Morelli never spoke of the past. But every morning, he placed one fresh loaf inside. Walter came in once. Not to take bread, but to leave something behind, a folded $5 bill and his dog tags, placed quietly beneath the box. He turned and walked out without a word. No one stopped him. In the spring, a high school student wrote an essay about him. She had been in the courtroom the day the judge stood. Her paper was titled, "Some Heroes Return Without Applause." It won a citywide contest. She never got to interview Walter, but she said she didn't need to. She said his silence had spoken more than any testimony ever could. As the seasons turned again, Walter grew older. His walks became shorter. His posture stooped slightly. But he never missed a visit to the park. And always, he carried one thing in his coat, the rosary Margaret had once wrapped around his wrist before his last tour. The final time he visited the plaque, he sat longer than usual. The air was still. A few veterans stood nearby, not speaking. The sun drifted low through the trees, and shadows lengthened across the stone. Walter closed his eyes. He passed in his sleep that night, in his own bed, with the photo of his unit above him, the shoebox of letters nearby, and the rosary in his hand. When word spread, the judge came to his funeral. So did Officer Jenkins. So did dozens of men and women who had once worn the same uniform. They buried Walter with honors. The flag was folded. A bugle played. No eulogies were given. But as they lowered the casket, a young boy stepped forward and placed a single slice of bread on top. It was all he had. And somehow, it was exactly right. The judge spoke only once, to no one in particular. Sometimes a country forgets. But a soldier remembers. The wind moved gently through the leaves, and for a moment, it sounded like the whisper of pages turning, letters written, stories closed, one last salute from a world that had finally remembered its quietest guardian. And though Walter Grady asked for nothing, he left behind something that would outlast even a medal. A reminder. Kindness without question is enough.